September 18, 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act is enacted and would become one of the causes of the beginning of the end of slavery. The act would be repealed 14 years later on June 28, 1864, a few months after Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Fugitive Slave Act granted slaveholding states an ability to expand their reach beyond their borders. Previously, if a fugitive slave made it to free soil, they could gain their freedom. The act made it so that even these free states weren't safe, as it stipulated that any fugitive could be captured and returned to slavery, with the added fear of federal-level punishment for anyone found helping them. Enter Canada and the Underground Railroad. Having abolished slavery in 1834, Canada represented freedom that the previously safe northern states couldn't provide as much anymore.
Friend of a friend?
Friend of a friend. Secret networks of safe houses and terminals dotted the landscape in secrecy to help smuggle fugitive slaves out of the United States. Canada was the end of the line for many of these travelers. Conductors, like Harriet Tubman, were in charge of helping escapees make it to freedom. Tubman is incredibly well known for having escorted over 300 individuals to freedom. Cargo, passenger, package, and freight refer to the individuals escaping slavery. Stations, or depots, were safe houses that dotted the Underground Railroad lines. Station master was the title given to a diverse group of anti-slavery supporters who operated a safe house. And finally, terminals, which referred to the cities where safe houses were located. Many station masters were women, and some worked alongside their husbands to provide temporary lodging, nourishment, financial support, and a change of clothes for any escapee that they received. From the implementation of the Fugitive Slave Act to the onset of the Civil War, upwards of 20,000 men, women, and children fleeing slavery came to Canada. With these kinds of numbers, it was impossible for the country to ignore.
So, what do you call yourself?
Harriet.
Anti-slavery societies in Canada had been established in the early 19th century, but none garnered much traction. Come 1851, the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada had been founded as an immediate outcome of the number of freedom seekers arriving in the country due to the Fugitive Slave Act. Extending all the way to Montreal, and with roughly 200 members, it became an incredibly influential abolitionist group. Formed in Ontario, the goal of the society was not only to spread the word of abolitionism, but to provide to the refugees coming up from the South a sense of community in this new land. Torontonians such as George and Gordon Brown were writing about the influx of fugitives in anti-slavery editorials in their newspaper, The Globe, one of the most influential newspapers in Canada at the time. George became a member of the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada and used his connection with the newspapers to spread the message of abolitionism to the citizens of Toronto. Other prominent black members were Wilson Abbott, a businessman, Henry Bibb, the editor of The Voice of the Fugitive, and a grocer, Albert Jones. The society was founded by Michael Willis, a Presbyterian minister. Several other Christian denominations were part of this society, such as Baptists, Congregationalists, Methodists, and Quakers. By the first meeting in 1851, they created a constitution, a set of bylaws, and 4 resolutions. The society's objective was
to aid in the extinction of slavery all over the world by means exclusively lawful and peaceable, moral and religious, such as by diffusing of useful information and argument, by tracts, newspapers, lectures, and correspondence, and by manifesting sympathy with the houseless and homeless victims of slavery flying to our soil.
The society had transnational relations with their American anti-slavery counterparts as well. Frederick Douglass did a lecture series in conjunction with the society. Michael Willis spoke in New York City at a gathering of the American Anti-Slavery Society to discuss the conditions in Canada. Women also played a role in abolitionism. The Toronto Ladies Association for the Relief of the Destitute Colored Fugitives raised money and gathered clothing to distribute to the new arrivals. Many of these women were the wives of the men in the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. There were 40 women that participated in this group, of which Ethelinda Lewis was the only known colored woman. These Canadian women, along with their British sisters, participated in the Stafford House Address in 1853. The address was a petition directed towards American women to help cease slave labor in their country. Over 500,000 women throughout the Empire signed this petition, with 14,000 of those signatures coming from the Toronto Ladies Association. By the time of the turn of the decade, activities in both of these societies were starting to dwindle. By the time the war was over, many of the refugees returned to their now liberated home states. But by the same token, many chose to stay in Canada. Canada's black population continued to grow throughout the 1850s. Settlements started popping up in West Ontario, through Quebec, and even into the Maritimes. The opportunity to have land, a home, and the ability to socialize and live in a community of free people started to shape what the black experience was like in the Dominion of Canada. For instance, the Elgin settlement in Canada West proved to be incredibly successful. Established by Reverend William King after having inherited 15 slaves, this settlement showed industry and agency at its finest. Each settler was entitled to a 50-acre plot of land with a 10-year grace period to pay it off. Houses had certain building codes to allow for uniformity and to maintain the image of being well kept. Even the schools thrived, and their level of education rivaled the white schools so much that they closed, making the Buxton schools the first to be racially integrated. The social complexities of such populations and kinship groups provide another angle on why some of these Canadians enlisted. Despite having found freedom in Canada, some African Americans saw it as a place of temporary refuge. Due to the nature of their arrival in the Dominion, many previously enslaved persons left family behind in America. For some, these physical ties back to the States was enough for them to return for the war. For individuals born in Canada, on the other hand, the motivation to enlist lay elsewhere. Many believed that the war would influence their lives positively, regardless of borders. Namely, the Emancipation Proclamation coming into play was a sign that equality was a step closer, regardless of the country of issue. Their inclination to obey the call to action was to defend their right to liberty and to protect their newfound communities. For some, like Lucien Boyd, returning home to then be put in prison for enlisting in a foreign war might not have been the desired outcome. Conditions in the army for black men weren't something to be desired. They got less pay and were often treated poorly by their brothers in arms, even Union men. With these factors blending into the political and social melting pot of Canada in the 1850s, it was no wonder that Canadians felt that they too had some part to play in the war. The background upon which Canadians chose to enlist was one based on not only social and political complexities, but the fundamental belief that they too could make change. And while it was an American conflict, the proximity of the two countries made it so that the transfer of values and the right to liberty was borderless. April 12, 1861. The war started with the storming of Fort Sumter. Tensions had been rising for some time following the Declaration of Secession from North Carolina. When the fort was bombarded by the Confederate Army, it marked the first battle of the Civil War. Britain and Canada started to identify as politically neutral. However, socially, Canadians had their own opinions. There was an ideological split between supporting the Union or Confederate side. Some Canadians felt a kinship with the South, a smaller power defying a larger one that wasn't protecting their interests. Some would say it was a similar situation to Anglo-Canadian relations at the time. Because of this, companies and businesses sold weapons and offered support to both sides. Even Confederate hubs started to spring up in Canada, namely in Montreal and the Maritimes. Over 40,000 Canadians enlisted from all different backgrounds. 3,600 enlisted with the Confederacy, while the remaining 36,400 enlisted in the Union. Reasons for enlisting are different for everyone, but some include the prospect of financial gain, belief in the cause, adventure, and opportunity.
Safe and sound
Confederate President Jefferson Davis decided to send 2 diplomats to Great Britain and France in order to secure not only economic partners, but also potential supporters of the Confederate cause. James Mason and John Slidell boarded the Trent, a British merchant mail steamer. As it was sailing through the Bahamas, it was intercepted by an American vessel, the USS Jacinto. Mason and Slidell were found aboard the ship and were sent to prison. The Trent was free to go. Under the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, any nation who breached another's sovereignty could have war declared against them. The treaty mainly applied to land masses, however, Britain saw the actions of the Trent as a breach of international law. Great Britain asked the U.S. to release the 2 Confederate diplomats and issue a formal apology. The U.S. took no immediate action, and Britain started preparing for war. The U.S. Secretary of State, William Seward, was ready. He believed releasing the captives would show that the Union was weak. If Mason and Slidell were to be successful in their diplomatic mission, it would end the Union forever. Lincoln and his administration intervened with the apt message of one war at a time. Due to this small crisis, the Civil War was on the brink of involving international powers. If it hadn't been dealt with, Canada would have been at the center of this conflict. It was only 2 years later, in 1863, that another crisis would occur. The Chesapeake incident started with 16 Confederate men boarding the steamer ship. The ship was en route to Maine. However, the men took possession and killed members of the crew. They decided to sail up to St. John's, New Brunswick, to deposit the gunpowder and coal reserves that the ship had in storage, in hopes that they could soon sell it to the South. The Maritimes had become a Confederate hotspot during and after the war, so it made sense that they wanted to dock there. After being refused in port, the Chesapeake decided to sail north to Halifax, Nova Scotia. While en route, news had already started spreading that the Chesapeake had been captured and that the American ships, the USS Ella, Annie, and Dakota, were already in pursuit. On December 17th, the Chesapeake was recaptured by the Union, docked, and put under arrest. For the second time, the United States had infringed on British sovereignty. Within a few days, British soldiers were being mobilized to the border in preparation for potential conflict.
Je m'appelle Calixa Lavallée.
Je suis né le 28 décembre 1842 à Verchères, un petit village près de Montréal. C'est là que j'ai développé ma passion ainsi mon talent en musique. Pendant que je performais au Conservatoire royal de Montréal, un compositeur américain est venu me visiter et il voulait m'embaucher. Au départ, j'ai refusé. Moi, un catholique, un Canadien qui va aux États-Unis, c'est imaginable. Enfin, j'ai déménagé au Rhode Island. Je me suis enregistré dans le 4e régiment de Rhode Island pour la Union Army en tant que joueur de cornet. J'ai participé à plein de batailles, dont une est sûrement la plus horrible, celle qui s'est passée à Antietam. J'ai frôlé la mort quand j'ai reçu une balle à la jambe. Et c'est pour ça que j'ai démissionné et j'ai retourné au Canada. Pendant les années qui passaient, j'allais plusieurs fois entre la frontière pour jouer mes symphonies pour le grand public. J'ai eu beaucoup de succès, mais tout a changé quand j'ai reçu l'offre de son seigneur, le lieutenant-gouverneur of Québec, Theodore Robitaille. Son seigneur, le lieutenant, a demandé de commissionner une chanson pour célébrer la première fête nationale, la Saint-Jean-Baptiste. C'est là, avec mon influence militaire, que j'ai composé la chanson au Canada, avec l'aide de Sir Adolphe Bassé-Routier.
Calixa Lavallée would pass away on January 21, 1891. His legacy is best remembered with the National Anthem of Canada, which was voted in by the House of Commons in 1980.
My name is Anderson Abbott. My parents escaped slavery and moved to Canada long before I was born. They operated a general store, and because of this, they were able to buy large plots of land around Toronto. By the time I was born, my family was doing well and were respected in our community. Due to their prosperous business, they were able to send me to school. I attended Buxton Mission, a racially integrated school near Chatham, Canada West. I continued my education at the Toronto School of Medicine in order to become a doctor. I worked hard and was proud to be under the tutelage of Dr. Alexander Augusta. I received my medical license in 1861. Things changed when Abe was assassinated. I was shocked and devastated. Mrs. Lincoln offered me the shawl he wore during his inauguration in 1861 as a token of our friendship. Since I had nothing to hold me back in the States, I decided to move on and go back to Canada. I opened my own clinic and trained other African Americans and Canadians. The rest of my career involved traveling frequently between Canada and the United States, taking position of hospital chairman as well as surgeon-in-chief.
Anderson Ruffin Abbott would pass away in 1913 at the age of 76 in Toronto. He was the first African Canadian to graduate medical school and become a surgeon. He paved the way for other African Canadians to pursue an education in the medical field.
My name is Edward Doherty. My parents were born in Ireland, but I was born in Wickham, Canada. After serving a few years in the Union Army, I was promoted to lieutenant in the 16th New York Cavalry. I stayed with them for the rest of the war, protecting the capital, Washington, D.C. I proved that an Irishman can clearly not only lead a regiment, but also protect the United States. When the president was assassinated and his killer, John Wilkes Booth, fled, I was in charge of finding him. 10 days after the assassination, I organized my men and we set off to find him. We cornered him at a barn in Port Royal, Virginia. At first, I tried to talk to Booth and get him to come out. However, he refused and I had no choice but to try other tactics. I shot Booth twice in the back. We brought his body back to Washington, D.C. We were celebrated as heroes.
Doherty continued to serve in the U.S. military until 1871 when he retired. He moved to New York City where he passed away on April 3, 1897 at the age of 59.
I was just 15 when I ran from my home in New Brunswick. In order to pursue my life, I had to change. My name is Sarah Edmonds, but the men in my regiment know me as Frank Thompson. I sold Bibles for a time and eventually moved to Michigan when I enlisted in the 2nd Michigan Infantry. Throughout the war, I served as a soldier, spy, mail carrier, and as a field nurse. I came across a wounded soldier at Antietam. When I came to his aid, he confessed to me that he was a woman. She was just like me. I wasn't alone. Due to this encounter, I had a bigger responsibility. In 1863, after being marked a deserter, I decided to remain as Sarah Edmonds and work as a nurse in the United States Christian Commission. I reconnected with my friends from the regiment, and they could hardly believe my story. But a number of them helped me by sending letters to the War Office. They changed my title from deserter to honorably discharged.
Sarah Emma Edmonds was the first woman to receive a veteran's pension in the United States. She lived the rest of her life in the U.S., but never forgot her Canadian roots. The war changed Canada. The political climate of the Civil War and the decades leading up to it could contribute to the war's greatest legacy on their northern neighbors, becoming a country. The threat of being invaded by Americans was nothing new, but with a battle-hardened army, military technology the world had never before seen, and a history of sovereignty being threatened, it doesn't seem to be much of a coincidence that Canada became a country a mere 813 days after the conclusion of the Civil War. Ironically enough, Canada became a sort of free South. Not only was it a place for escaped slaves to start a new life and enjoy freedom, it was also a place where former Confederates could escape to avoid persecution. 29 U.S. Medals of Honor were granted to Canadians. 5 became generals. In 2017, a memorial was installed in South Stormont, Ontario by the Greys and Blues of Montreal, a reenacting group for the American Civil War. This is the only national monument that commemorates the 40,000 Canadian participants. What can we take away from this event? While the war is still one that is deeply entrenched in American history, it does have a part in the Canadian story as well. This war provided an interesting stage to display the moral drama that surrounded the question of freedom, that these questions were answered by people who saw this as an opportunity to, in broad strokes, use their agency and take the route of action. In examining the Civil War in such a way, the regular storyline has changed. Now is the time to tell a different tale, one that looks at the war through the lens of freedom seekers and fighters, the northern neighbor and activism. The past isn't that far away, and maybe the lessons of yesteryear aren't too old to learn.